Coming up on Jerusalem Dateline, Iran's Ayatollah Khamenei dismisses overtures from President Trump, and a UN report frames Israel's actions in Gaza as crimes against humanity. Israel also carries out military strikes inside Syria to head off threats from the new government. And the Houthis in Yemen threaten to attack shipping in the Red Sea. Plus, an agreement between the citizens of northeast Syria and the Al-Julani regime. All this and more coming up on this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Iran's supreme leader rejected President Trump's appeal to restart negotiations over its nuclear program, which could set the stage for U.S. military action to stop Iran's weapons development program. And a new UN report, which ignores October 7th, accuses Israel of sexual violence against women during the war against Hamas in Gaza. Here's the latest on these stories and more. On Wednesday, Ayatollah Khamenei dismissed President Trump's letter delivered by the UAE.
I think this is an attempt to deceive global public opinion. This means America wants to talk, make peace, and stop fighting. But Iran is not ready to negotiate.
President Trump has said there are two ways Iran can be handled: militarily or you make a deal. Earlier this month, Israel and the U.S. held a joint military exercise, including a B-52 bomber, which is seen as a clear message to Iran. In the Oval Office Wednesday, President Trump told reporters no one's expelling anyone from Gaza. His initial proposal including the relocation of all the residents of Gaza so the U.S. could take over and rebuild the territory. Research suggests many Gazans actually want to leave the devastated territories and relocate to countries where they can live in peace. Egypt's opposition to relocating Gazans reportedly causing a rift in its relations with the U.S. The administration notified Cairo it will reduce military aid in 2026. Trump has hinted he'd cut off aid if Egypt did not agree to accept Gazans fleeing the war zone. Egypt receives more than $2 billion in annual aid, most of that in military assistance. On its northern border, Israel is carrying out military strikes inside Syria to eliminate a military threat from the new government. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz warned Syria's new leader that it's prepared to hold key positions in Syria for an indefinite time.
Every morning when Al-Julani opens his eyes in the presidential palace in Damascus, he will see the IDF watching him from the heights of Mount Hermon and will remember that we are here and in all the security areas in southern Syria to protect the residents of the Golan and the Galilee from any threat from him and his jihadist friends.
Katz also pledged to defend the Druze community inside Syria and said they would be allowed to enter the Golan Heights for work. Katz's pledge to the Druze comes in the context of a massacre of Alawites, a minority Islamic sect, and Christians by Islamist groups inside Syria. In a rare diplomatic development, 100 senior figures from Syria's Druze community are set to visit the Israeli-controlled Golan Heights on Friday. The UN Human Rights Council report alleges Israel systematically destroyed women's health care facilities during the war against Hamas in Gaza and uses sexual violence as a war strategy.
Sexual and gender-based violence is increasingly used as a method of war by Israel to destabilize, dominate, oppress and destroy the Palestinian people. The Commission documented a pattern of sexual violence, including cases of rape and other forms of sexual violence, torture and other inhumane acts that amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity.
We've seen an unbelievable blood label.
Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar blasted the report.
The so-called Commission of Inquiry of the Human Rights Council of the United Nations published one of the worst blood labels the world has ever seen, and we had seen many. It accuses the victims of the crimes committed against them. Hamas is the organization that has committed horrific sexual crimes against Israelis on October 7. It is indeed a sick publication that only an anti-Semitic organization could produce.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, some women's groups, and Israel's mission to the UN rejected the report as unfounded and anti-Semitic. On X, U.S. Ambassador-designate to the UN, Elise Stefanik, said the report ignores October 7th. The so-called Human Rights Council has failed to condemn the barbaric atrocities committed by Hamas terrorists against Israel, including the brutal slaughter, torture, kidnapping of thousands of innocent civilians, and Hamas's horrific use of rape and sexual violence against Israeli women and girls, yet disgracefully attacks Israel with unfounded smears. Concerning the hostage talks, Hamas announced they will release U.S.-Israeli hostage Edan Alexander, the last living American hostage in captivity, and the bodies of 4 dual nationals. The announcement comes as U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff is in Qatar and presented a new proposal. It would extend the ceasefire by several weeks. In return, Hamas would release 5 living hostages and 10 dead hostages. The UN report against Israel comes at a key moment, as Israelis and Jews around the world today celebrate Purim, when many dress up in costumes to mark the holiday. It celebrates the time 2,500 years ago when Haman, a wicked ruler in Persia, which is now modern Iran, plotted to destroy the Jewish people. As recorded in the book of Esther, God raised up a beautiful Jewish queen named Esther to expose and stop those plans. Now, centuries later, Israelis say they again face wicked rulers in Iran who want to destroy Israel and the Jewish people. Today, many Jews and Christians around the world believe God will thwart the plans of today's wicked rulers, just like he did 2,500 years ago. Between developments in Syria, Judea and Samaria, and concerning the war with Hamas, events in the Middle East seem to be happening at breakneck speed. CBN News correspondent Gary Lane caught up with Alex Trayman of the Jewish News Syndicate for an overview.
Threats, unity agreements, and the future of the Syrian Druze. Houthi rebels in Yemen are threatening once again to attack ships destined for Israel. Meanwhile, Syrian Kurds and their defense forces are uniting with the interim federal government, while Israel is flying jets over Syria to send a message of support for the minority Druze population. Well, joining us with some insights is Alex Trayman. He's Jewish News Syndicate Jerusalem Bureau Chief. Alex, it's good to talk again. So these Houthis in Yemen are threatening to resume attacks, more drone strikes against Israel and her trade partners. How do you expect Israel to respond to that new threat?
Gary, thanks for having me. I believe that Israel will respond with force, as it has from time to time. I also believe that the United States may respond with force, and we've already seen recently that the United States has struck near the Hodeidah port in Yemen, and Israel has struck many times in Yemen as well. You know, Yemen has done very little to harm Israeli infrastructure, but they've been a pesky nuisance and one that must be forced to stop.
Yeah, mostly to the shipping lanes there. And it's all about aid to Gaza, they say, the cutoff of food and electricity. So far, it doesn't seem like that tactic is working to get Hamas to release the remaining hostages. What must be done? The U.S. has already had a one-off, unfruitful direct meeting with Hamas.
Well, I think it was important that the United States new administration saw directly who they're dealing with Hamas, that Hamas was not willing to play ball and get these hostages released. They're not willing to let go of power in the Strip. They don't want an exit or an exile from the Strip. They're willing to stay in and fight as long as it takes, as long as they're still alive. I think that we're getting much closer to seeing a renewed Israeli military offensive inside the Gaza Strip if we don't see the fast return of the remaining hostages.
Well, I mean, President Trump has said repeatedly, all hell is going to break loose. That's a quote from him. So we haven't seen it yet. So is his patience wearing thin?
I think his patience is wearing thin. The question is, who's more forceful, President Trump or Prime Minister Netanyahu? Really, it's Israel's war to fight, and Israel has been willing to do everything that it can, including negotiate with terrorists, even signing immoral agreements to allow prisoners, murderous prisoners, out of jail to get hostages back home. Netanyahu wants all the hostages back home. The Israeli people want them all back home, but at the same time, the only cards that the Hamas has to play with here are the hostages, and I think that the timing for Hamas is running out.
And in Syria, Alex, Israel is showing support for the Druze population there with jet flyovers. This after the recent slaughter of members of the Alawite minority in western Syria. And some are suggesting a separate state for the 2 million Syrian and Golan Druze population, and that may protect them. So what are your thoughts?
Well, Israel wants to make sure that this group, HTS, led by Al-Julani, who's backed by Turkey and became the new president of Syria, does not move down towards the south and pose a new threat directly to Israel. Now, what's interesting, as you mentioned, is that you have a large Druze population in southern Syria. You also have a Kurdish population that is really connected geographically to this Druze population. Both the Kurds and the Druze are aligned with Israel. In fact, Israel has a large population of Druze inside Israel that are loyal to Israel. Many of them serve in the military or the police here in Israel, and they've asked Israel for help, and Israel is standing up for the Druze brothers that are across the Syrian border and demonstrating that they will not let Turkey or an Al-Qaeda affiliated group like HTS led by Al-Julani move down towards Israel in order to create a new ground for terrorism against this Jewish state.
And they have quite a militia there protecting themselves in places like Swaida and elsewhere. But let's talk about the Kurds, because in northern Syria, the Kurds have enjoyed autonomy. They're now joining forces with the new federal government. They signed a deal on that. What do you make of that move?
They're trying to protect their interests. There's definitely an alliance of at least sentiments between the Kurds and Israel, but the Kurds don't want to see what's now happened to the Alawites who are being murdered en masse by HTS, by Al-Julani's group. I think it's a move of self-preservation, and I think it's very important that people understand that in the Middle East, people are always looking to see who's the power broker, who's the strong horse, and they're doing things that they need to do to protect their own self-interests.
Well, I understand they're even going to be granted the right, which Assad didn't allow them to have their own language and use that in school and in writing and communications and so forth. Is that true?
I believe so.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to wait and see how that develops. We pray it doesn't go south for the Kurds, who are American allies and also allies of Israel. Alex Trayman of the Jewish News Syndicate. As always, Alex, we thank you for sharing your perspective.
Thanks for having me.
After decades of work with ethnic minorities, Nadine Maenza is an expert in chronicling the quest for religious freedom in the Middle East. Her updates from northeast Syria have told an inspiring story of Kurdish communities and others creating a multi-ethnic, multi-religious democratic government. Here's our conversation about a historic recent development with the Kurds and the new Syrian regime. Nadine Maenza, the president of the International Religious Freedom Roundtable, thanks for joining us. Just days ago, General Maslum Abdi, the head of the U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces, he controls much of northeast Syria. He signed an agreement with President al-Shara of the interim Syrian government. Before we talk to you about that agreement, can you explain to people what's happened in northeast Syria in the last 12 years or so? And what kind of government is there?
Right. So as the Syrian Democratic Forces were the U.S. partners in the fight against ISIS. And of course, these legendary battles, they went city by city and they pushed ISIS out of those cities. But the untold story is they also empowered the local communities to set up self-governance, empowering them to do it themselves, including all religious and ethnic minorities. So what this has done is set up these institutions, these governments, local governments throughout the Northeast that have really transformed the society, changing the religious freedom conditions, and really building this peace and stable place, except for the outside threats they face, of course.
You've been in touch with the people there. What is this new agreement?
Yeah, so this new agreement is really an agreement to agree, but it has some very important points. I think one of of course, the very first point of the agreement makes it clear that everyone should have rights, including regardless of their religion or ethnicity. And of course, I'd expect an agreement to come out of northeast Syria like that. It also is the first time that Kurds have ever been mentioned in an official document of having citizenship. But I think the important parts here is it also gives them the ability to keep these institutions they've built, rather than dismantling them and starting over or bringing in people from Damascus to run. Instead, they're going to continue running governments with their local communities, but they're going to be under Damascus. The SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, are not going into the military individually. They're going in as a group, but they will be securing their own communities. So they'll become the local police for Northeast Syria. So this is a way that they can keep moving forward with what they've done in Northeast Syria, but also be a part of the country of Syria.
Yeah, you've been in touch with many of the leaders there. What are they telling you?
Yeah, everyone is surprised and excited by how quickly this moved. Lots of questions about what it looks like from other leaders in Northeast Syria because it happened so quickly. It appears that there were discussions were made public, but after the violence in the coastal regions, al-Shara sped everything up, and I think they saw an opportunity to close the deal quickly. And so it all happened quicker than most people expected, even than they expected. But it actually gives them a huge advantage. And it's important to note right after this, the next day, an agreement similar was made with the Druze in southern Syria. So it looks like al-Shara has backed away from his initial demands that everyone fold into the government, and actually coming in the way that they're built in order and to provide their own protection, which I think is a good model for all of Syria.
On the other hand, Nadine, some are deeply concerned about al-Shara, his past with Islamist groups like Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS. Can he be trusted?
Well, I think the point is you trust no one in these areas, I think is how they pretty much function. And so the way that this deal is set up is it doesn't really require trust as much as at any point in time the Northeast can pull out of this deal. So they haven't made a promise to forever be a part of the government.
There's been horrific scenes of a massacre in Syria, mainly on the western coast. What's the latest, and how can people pray?
Well, we're still seeing violence happen, although it's certainly not as widespread as it was several days ago. People are very scared. That we're hearing gunmen still going through certain villages, especially in the Banya area. We'd ask people to pray for their protection, pray that the violence stops, and that there is justice and accountability. It almost sounds ridiculous to demand this, but this is what the people deserve. And al-Shara did condemn the violence. He promised there would be punishment even for those closest to them. And so what we need to see now are more arrests, because there have been several, and accountability for those who've committed these crimes that are part of the security services, or there won't be trust for this government. So al-Shara's got a big job ahead of him, not just bringing in these other areas of Syria, but also proving to the people of Syria that he's for them, and there are not going to be continued violence against religious and ethnic communities.
Yeah. Nadine Menza, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thursday night at Trump Tower in New York, 95 individuals from the group Jewish Voice for Peace were arrested, protesting the detention of a former Columbia University student and pro-Hamas activist Mahmoud Khalil. The Trump administration has made moves to deport him because of his activities on Columbia University's campus. And President Trump warns that his arrest is the first of many. Here's CBN correspondent Caitlin Burke's report from earlier this week, which we follow with commentary by CBN President Gordon Robertson.
As a grad student, Mahmoud Khalil is in the country on a green card. Last year, though, he helped lead pro-Palestinian protests at Columbia, actions the Trump administration believes to be aligned with Hamas, a designated terror organization.
Our main demand, which is divestment from the Israeli occupation, there's an impasse in that.
Khalil became one of the most visible campus activists last year, acting as a negotiator for students who erected a tent encampment on Columbia's campus. Now his lawyer says he's being held at a Louisiana detention facility due to President Trump's executive orders prohibiting anti-Semitism.
They've invoked this broad, vague immigration authority that in theory allows, with due process, the removal of someone based on a certification of the Secretary of State that they're compromising national security interests. This is a preposterous and dangerous extension of that authority, and is basically meant to remove spies, not individuals engaged in human rights activism.
Mahmoud Khalil was an individual who was given the privilege of coming to this country to study at one of our nation's finest universities and colleges. And he took advantage of that opportunity, of that privilege, by siding with terrorists.
A federal judge has temporarily blocked Khalil's deportation while the case plays out in court.
His speech is absolutely protected by the Constitution, and it should be chilling to everyone that the United States government could punish or try to deport someone because they disapprove of the speech they're engaged in.
Still, Trump says more arrests are coming, writing on Truth Social, quote, "If you support terrorism, including the slaughtering of innocent men, women, and children, your presence is contrary to our national and foreign policy interests, and you are not welcome here."
This is an individual who organized group protests that not only disrupted college campus classes and harassed Jewish American students and made them feel unsafe on their own college campus, but also distributed pro-Hamas propaganda, flyers with the logo of Hamas.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio writing on X, quote, "We will be revoking the visas and/or green cards of Hamas supporters in America so they can be deported." Mark Caleb Smith, the director of the Center for Political Studies at Cedarville University, tells CBN News this case brings up the larger question of how much authority we want to put in the hands of the executive branch.
I understand at some level we might be sitting here thinking, you know, of course we're against someone who espouses support for an organization that we generally do see as terrorists, but think through what this would mean for another president from another party or with a different ideology who might have a different approach in defining what terrorism or terrorist activity really is. And so broadening that amount of power could lead to some really severe abuse.
A hearing for Khalil is scheduled for later today, and his attorney has requested he be returned to New York while the case plays out. Caitlin Burke, CBN News, Washington.
Well, I'm all for free speech, and free speech includes speech that you absolutely hate. And everyone has a right to their opinion. Everybody has a right to free expression. Everybody has a right to free assembly. But let me remind you what happened at Columbia University. The president of that university issued a call for the New York police to come and intervene. And it's interesting the wording that was used, a clear and present danger. This isn't just speech. There was violence on that campus, and there were calls to violence. There were calls to support a terror organization that was in charge of Gaza, that launched a horrific attack against Israel and was holding U.S. citizens as hostages. This individual is a graduate now of Columbia University. They're no longer a student. And so why should we have, student protests? He's not a student anymore. He led an uprising, and he took over buildings, and he urged violence, and he urged violence against Jewish students of that same university who said, we're no longer safe here. Well, in my view, that's no longer a speech issue. That is a violence issue. And when you do that kind of thing, when you take over university buildings and you destroy property and you threaten violence, well, no longer is it speech. You've committed a crime. And now is it proper for the State Department to say you're no longer welcome here? Well, the courts are going to have to rule on this. Again, I'm all for free speech, but in my view, this isn't speech.
Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and you can also access CBN content through our CBN News and other CBN apps. And please keep praying for the peace of Jerusalem, for protection for IDF soldiers and all those caught in harm's way, and for the soon release of all the hostages from Gaza. We'll leave you with a few verses from Psalm 46, verses 10 and 11. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. I'm Chris Mitchell. For all of us here at the Jerusalem Bureau, we'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.